Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well, and thank you so much for joining our Moment Magazine explainer, this time about two-state solution, one-state solution. What is it all good for? My name is Nathan Guttman, and in the next few minutes, I will try to share with you some thoughts about one-state, two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And most important, I would like to keep it as some kind of a primer, an explainer, because recently, and I'm sure you're all aware of it, there is a lot of talk about whether Israel and the Palestinians should keep on pursuing a two-state solution or whether it's time to move over to a one-state solution. This conversation has been sparked, as we all know, or many of us know, by the very in-depth article of Peter Beinart and Jewish Currents, and later on a shorter version of it in the New York Times, in which basically he said, look, I was a proponent of a two-state solution all my life. I want to see peace in the Middle East, but now I've reached the point in which I think a one-state solution will be better. So I'm just hoping that in the next few minutes we can try to clarify these terms so we have a better idea of what we're talking about when we are arguing about a two-state versus one-state solution. And hopefully all of us will be a little more informed before we jump into this Twitter brawl. Although, as anyone who's been on Twitter ever in his life knows, you don't really have to be informed about anything before you voice your opinions on Twitter. But still, for those who choose to do it in the next few minutes, I'll try to give a little explainer. And at the end, we'll have time for questions. And we'll try to keep this as brief as possible. So what are we talking about when we're talking about a two-state versus one-state solution? Basically, this is the answer to the problem being the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The fact that we have under Israeli control right now between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are two people living, the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. And how do you solve this problem, this ongoing conflict that has been tearing the region for decades? Do we do it by dividing the area into two states or in calling it all one equal state? So before we dive into that, just a tiny bit of background on how we got to this situation. Right now, as I mentioned, there are two people basically in this land that is being controlled / occupied by Israel. There are about 9 million Israelis living there. 6.7 million of them are Israeli Jews. That makes up about 74% of the population of Israel proper. 2 million of them are Arabs with Israeli citizenship. And then we have the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, areas occupied by Israel in 1967, in which you have about 4.5 million Palestinian Arabs living, most of them Muslim. Their current situation right now, for those who are not as familiar with it, they are residents of the West Bank and Gaza. The authority that controls them is the Palestinian Authority, but they are occupied by Israel. They do not vote in Israel. They do not control their borders and many other aspects of sovereign life. If you need more history, there's really tons of history about how we got to the situation, how the idea of dividing the land has come up. I just maybe would mention a few really brief important points on the way. Of course, the Balfour Declaration, which recognized the Jewish people's right to have their homeland in historic Palestine. The 1937 Peel Commission that raised for the first time the idea of dividing the land between a Jewish state and an Arab state. And of course, most important, the 1947 partition plan adopted by the United Nations, which basically set course for Israeli independence in the land. And the idea behind it was having a Jewish state mostly on the western part of the area, an Arab state. They didn't use the term Palestinian, an Arab state mostly on the eastern and parts of the southern regions of the area, and also a small international area which would be in charge of the holy places in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem. Now, that was 1947. Since then, a lot has happened. Israel declared independence. In 1948, a war broke out, the Palestinian Nakba. Israel sort of adopted the partition plan. The Arab countries sort of rejected it. The war did away with this plan anyways, because it created a reality on the ground, which was a result of the ceasefire lines after the 1948 war has ended. There was a massive refugee problem that was created by Palestinians who left, or part of them were expelled from Israel. And then there was the 1967 war, in which Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and many, many issues in between, which led us to the point in which we are now. One region, one country in which two people are living, and this is probably one of the most troubling and most important territorial and national conflicts in the world right now, centered with these two people in this pretty small piece of land. So, a two-state solution. What is the idea of a two-state solution? Basically, this idea is around since the 1970s, and it became more relevant in the 90s after the Oslo Accords were signed. Based on the crux of this idea is that you divide the country pretty much along the lines of that were drawn after the end of the 1948 war, the 1948 armistice lines. And in the east, there would be a Jewish state. In the west, there would be a Palestinian state. And somewhere in between, there would be Jerusalem as a joint capital or a divided capital. And the idea behind it is, look, you look at this solution, each people have their own independent sovereign state. There are no more claims, and they live together for years to come, and everything is going to be beautiful in the Middle East. And this is basically, ever since, this is what we're talking about when we talk about the peace process, the Middle Eastern peace process. It's all about attempts to somehow turn this idea of dividing the land into two people into a reality that can actually turn into a peace accord, which will allow the two people to live there peacefully. What's the great appeal of the two-state solution? Why did that become the standard for dealing with or for viewing the way out of this Israeli-Palestinian conflict? First of all, it's a compromise. It's a compromise that seems to be feasible if both sides are willing to undertake many things. In terms of ideology, each side has to give up something of its national dream. The Palestinians have to give up the notion that they will have a sovereign country that will include their historic, what they say their historic land, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, that all of that will be Palestine as their own state. And that accepting the two-state solution basically means you're giving up this dream. You're also giving up the dream of having Palestinian refugees return to places that they left in 1948, whether it's Jaffa or Acre or Haifa or all these other areas. Israel also has to make a pretty significant and ideological compromise under this idea of a two-state solution, which is to tell Israelis, listen, you have to give up the notion that you're going back to the biblical land of Israel, that the hilltops of Samaria and Judea, where the kings roamed and where the patriarchs are buried, and where the history of the Jewish people, as depicted in the Bible, actually took place. These are areas that will not be part of your homeland, or many of them won't be. They won't be part of your national state any longer, and that's something that Israel would also have to accept. That's on the ideological side, and the idea is that both sides will make these deep concessions, and it will make sense because if both sides have to go such a long way in order to meet each other, it kind of means that this is a just and a fair solution for the conflict. But these are the ideological difficulties. The thing is that the difficulties on the ground in actually implementing a two-state solution are much greater. And there are many of them, and I'll touch on them very briefly. First of all, borders. Where does a border go through? Does it go along the 1967 lines? Do you make any corrections? This is Facebook Live, so I don't really have a good way of sharing documents, but this is a map, and you see pretty much the Palestinian areas and the areas that are supposed to be the Israeli state. And even though the border, which we call the green line, is pretty clear, many things have changed since then, and it's not really clear where it would go by now. I'd say that most people that support a two-state solution agree that currently the green line should be the basis for a future border between Israel and an independent Palestinian state, but you will have some corrections and land swaps, which we'll get to in a second. Other issue is settlements. One of the biggest issues out there. You currently have at least about 600,000 Jewish settlers living in areas that are considered Palestinian areas. How do you solve this issue? I mean, I guess the obvious answer is, okay, well, you just pull them all out and form a Palestinian state where they used to be. That's not really feasible given the politics of Israel, given the public opinion in Israel, and also it's something pretty difficult to pull off. There are ways to get around it. One of them has to do with the settlement blocks. A big majority of these 600,000 or more Jewish settlers in the West Bank live in 3 settlement blocks that are pretty close to the border. So what you do basically, and again, we don't have a map here, but Google has tons of maps. Basically, you just redraw this green line, this 1967 line, in order to make the settlement blocks part of Israel, and in return, you give the future Palestinian state, land swaps. You give them equal amounts of land in other areas. That can work, and that can solve much of the problem. You will still have to dismantle all the further out settlements and pull out something like 100,000 Israeli settlers or more. And that will be very difficult to do. It will require a lot of political will. It will require force, maybe even. And that's one of the biggest obstacles, basically telling Israelis, you know, some of you will have to leave their homes and move back. And we're talking about settlers here that are second and third and fourth generation of settlers in these towns and villages. These aren't the people who came there knowing necessarily or understanding deeply the impact of where they live and what it means to the future of the region. These are people who were born there, whose parents were born there. So it's more difficult in that sense. So we talked about borders, we talked about settlements. What about the military aspect of it? Will the future Palestinian state be like any other state that has a military force, that controls its own military? Common sense says, yeah, sure, of course it will be like any other state. Israelis will say, hey, listen, we're losing a lot in terms of our security here. Right now, the West Bank gives us what we call strategic depth. It pushes our enemies further away to the east. It ensures that Israel, which is a pretty slim state when you look at it east to west, has more depth in it to block any kind of ground invasion. It also makes sure that any kind of rockets or missiles or other things that can endanger Israel won't be placed in the West Bank. So what happens with a future Palestinian state? Israel would want it to be demilitarized state. And, you know, you will not have your own army. You will not control your own security. In negotiations that did take place in the past decade or so in order to implement this two-state solution, there was some kind of openness on the Palestinian side to accept this idea, but this is a thorny problem, of course. There's also a problem of economy, of course. The Palestinian economy can independent? Will it be tied to the Israeli economy? What happens when we separate these two parts right now? Is there even a viable Palestinian economy on the other side to sustain a Palestinian state? But these are these aren't the biggest issues. They're bigger issues. What do you do with Jerusalem? Jerusalem just smack in the middle between Israel and the future Palestinian state. How do you divide it? That's an emotional issue for Israelis. It's an emotional issue for Palestinians too. It's not enough to say, oh, we'll just cut it in the middle or make it international or make it some access for all. That's the history of both sides. Lays right in those areas there of the old city, of the historic parts of Jerusalem. So there are models to solve this. There are ways that have been discussed in years of negotiations, but it will definitely not be easy to find a formula to divide Israel and make it a capital, Jerusalem, and make it a capital of both states. Then there's the issue of refugees, right? What do we do with the Palestinian refugees that left in 48 and 1967? Do they come back to Palestine, which is in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip right now, or can they come back anywhere? And if they can't, how do you reconcile that with the notion on the Palestinian side that a peaceful solution should resolve also the issue of the Palestinians? That's a big one. I can talk about problems of water resources and environment, but there's so much, there's so many actual bigger difficulties right now that we don't even get to that in the discussion. And not only that, the other issue is that as time goes by, these issues just become more and more difficult. And the biggest one right now, or one of the biggest one, is the contiguity of the land, because the West Bank isn't just the West Bank that it was in 1967. It's also full of Israeli settlements. Now, we said there are going to be settlement blocks and you're going to move some of them, but the problem is that in a small area, you're going to have these blocks that are under Israeli rule, and it will make it very difficult to keep a contiguous Palestinian state, a state that actually you can travel from north to south, from east to west within your own state without really encountering Israeli roadblocks or without having to bypass in a very awkward way the Israeli presence within what would be a Palestinian state. Bigger issue, of course, is what do you do with the connection between Gaza and the West Bank? Because both of them are supposed to be part of the Palestinian state. Gaza, West Bank, there's all this Israel in the middle. Now, again, these things have been discussed. There are ideas from bridges and tunnels and safe roads. There are ways to resolve it, but it won't be easy. And one last problem, which also makes this two-state solution very hard to see right now, is who controls it. The West Bank right now is controlled by Fatah, which is seen by and large, I'd say, by Israelis as a partner for negotiation. It accepts the idea of a two-state solution. It is willing to move ahead with Israel in it. But the Gaza Strip is controlled by Hamas. Hamas doesn't accept the two-state solution. So who are you signing this accord with? Who are you dividing the country with if at least one part of it won't even accept the idea of a two-state solution? So these are the practical difficulties. There's also an issue of political will, because at the end of the day, if there is a political will, you can resolve all of these issues. So who does want a two-state solution? The answer to that used to be easy. Everyone wants a two-state solution. The Israelis, Palestinians, the Americans, the Western world, everyone wants a two-state solution. But that's not the situation right now. First of all, the Americans, the Trump administration is less than enthusiastic about pushing forward a two-state solution, at least a two-state solution in the parameters that were seen as being fair by both sides in the past. We know that the Republican Party, for example, dropped the call for a two-state solution from its 2016 platform and will probably do it again for 2020. Now, President Trump's peace plan, his vision for peace, does include a call for Palestinian, for a two-state solution, for establishing a Palestinian state. But the land that is left for that is seen as much smaller than the Palestinians expect, and therefore it's seen as a kind of a non-starter. What about Israel? Now, in general, Israel is committed to a two-state solution. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke about, that in his famous Bar Ilan speech. But in practice, he's doing very little to promote the idea of a two-state solution. Building in the settlements continues, and as we said, that causes difficulties down the road to maintain a Palestinian state if it ever comes to life. He creates coalitions with right-wing parties that oppose a two-state solution, and in general, the Israeli public for more than a decade keeps on voting for a majority right-wing government that either opposes a two-state solution or is willing to do very little to promote this idea. When you look at public opinion polls, Israelis say that they support a two-state solution in a small margin, and they probably do, but if you look a little bit deeper into that, you see that basically they support a status quo. Ideally, they'd be willing to see a two-state solution. Practically, they're pretty content with the current situation of continuing the occupation as long as security is maintained for Israelis. So it's like two-state solution is an ideal, but in practice, it's a status quo. It's staying where we are right now. What about the Palestinians? Well, Palestinians did adopt the two-state solution after the Oslo Accord, but then came a period of involvement in terrorism during the Second Intifada, which made many Israelis doubt the fact that Palestinians actually are willing to live in peace alongside Israel. And right now, the Palestinian Authority, as we mentioned, is the president of the Palestinian Authority is Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, who is definitely committed to the idea of a two-state solution, but is doing very little to negotiate with the Israelis about how to make this happen. And we've seen rounds and rounds of failed negotiations, which I think the blame easily can be shared by Israelis and Palestinians for not making this happen. And of course, part of the Palestinian people are ruled by Hamas right now that doesn't even accept the two-state solution. And all this leads us to the question about, so what about if it's so difficult to implement a two-state solution, why not go for a one-state solution? The appeal of the idea of a one-state solution becomes more apparent when you look at all these practical difficulties in order to implement a two-state solution. And when you keep in mind that, it's been 53 years since the 1967 war, things aren't getting any better on the ground. So why not do a dramatic change and go for a one-state solution? Now, I'll just open parentheses here and say that there are two ways of looking at a one-state solution. One of them is just annexation. Israel annexes all the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and all what used to be Palestinian areas are now part of Israel. Palestinians living in them don't get any voting rights in Israel. They remain occupied people, but now under formal Israeli rule. Many people will say that there's no difference between that and an apartheid state, and basically that is a solution that is hard to see how it will have any kind of international backing or long-term support or will solve any problem. But that's not the interpretation of a one-state solution that I'm talking about today. When people now discuss a one-state solution, it's a different idea. The idea is that let's give up this idea of dividing this land into two people and just call it one state, a binational state, a multinational state, a state with a majority and a minority, something that people in the West really can relate to and understand and really like, because if it's a true democracy, what's the problem here? Why not have Israelis and Palestinians sharing the land? Minority rights will be protected thanks to the democratic institutions and the courts, and everyone can live their own life. And why are we even living through this conflict right now? Not to mention the fact that, if you grow to live together as one part of one country, generations from now, the conflict will be just a long forgotten memory, and no one will even understand why you need it, because Israelis and Palestinians will be one nation or one country that shares many things and is divided over some things. But first of all, it's not that easy. There are major problems or issues or shortcomings with the idea of a one-state solution. And the most obvious of them is that that is the end of the Jewish state. The Jewish state is basically the organizing idea behind Israel right now. When Israel was founded, it was founded as a Jewish and democratic state. There's a lot of debate how you maintain these two ideals together, but the idea was to implement the vision of Zionism, the return of the Jewish people to its nation state in its historic homeland, which is in Israel. Now, why do you lose all that? Because once you have one state, and in one state you have one man, one vote, and one woman, one vote, of course, then you have a democracy. And in this democracy right now, as we saw by the numbers, currently saying it's pretty much split half-half between Arabs and Jews that will live in this country. And pretty soon you'll have a situation in which you have a majority Arab population in this one state that we created. And it's a democracy, and it will no longer be a Jewish state in the sense that it gives preference to the Jewish people to maintain their tradition, to maintain their national heritage, or whatever comes up. Now, you can think of it in terms of practical issues. What happens in a one-state solution to the idea of return of the Jews to their homeland? Right now, there's a law in Israel called Chok HaShvut, which allows every Jew from America, from Russia, Argentina, Mexico, Iran, Egypt, anywhere they are, Ethiopia, to claim their Israeli citizenship and move to Israel, become citizens of Israel. Every Jew in the world is a potential citizen of Israel, and every Jew in the world can come to Israel and build their home there and become citizens. That won't happen if it's a binational democratic state. Definitely not if the majority of the state is Arab. It's hard to see how they will agree to that. So one of these key aspects of the Jewish homeland will be lost. How do you organize a state? Will it be a federative state with federal with states and regions that are Palestinians and others that are Jewish? And then what do you do with others that are mixed? Or do you maintain the structure that Israel has now, which is one national state? And then how do you protect the minority rights? What happens with religious legislation? How do you maintain the religious protections that Jews have right now in Israel if they're no longer a majority in it, if everything can be voted out? I mean, in general, one would say, and some demagogues have already said, oh, you have a one-state solution, one man, one vote. A majority of people within that land can decide to bring bulldozers and tear down the Western Wall and build their parking lot. What would stop them? There are many practical questions, and not even mentioning the smaller ones, such as the huge income gap and financial gaps between Palestinians and Israelis right now. How do you reconcile an economy of $40,000 GDP per person with a $4,000 GDP? What does it require each nation to do? How do you reconcile the cultures? And mainly, how does this resolve the issue that we started off in trying to resolving, and that is the desire of each one of these people to have a sovereign state. In other words, the one-state solution does have its appeal, but and this appeal grows as difficulties of implementing the two-state solution just increase, but it also has major problems in it. Who supports a one-state solution? Well, obviously, Peter Beinart, we just read the article. Some people on the progressive left, mainly outside Israel, support it. Very few people, either in Israel or in the Palestinian side or on the Palestinian side, support a one-state solution right now. But that doesn't mean that this isn't going to change and that the idea won't become more and more attractive as years go by and there's no movement on implementing a two-state solution. So just to try to kind of stop right here, and in summary, I'd say that this whole discussion or debate that's going on, a lot of it is just an intellectual exercise. We can argue what's better, what's worse, what's feasible, what's not. Is it which one of these solutions is more moral or more racist? The fact of the matter is that nothing is changing on the ground right now. I think that if there is any value to this discussion, it is that it reminds, or it can remind at least, those in power that the status quo is not sustainable. That this idea that we can keep on supporting a two-state solution forever, but doing nothing in order to implement it, doesn't mean that the solution will just stay there on the shelf and ready for the day that someone comes around to pick it up, excuse me, dust it off and implement it. The fact of the matter is that as time goes by, people give up on the two-state solution, which was and probably still is the obvious solution to the issue, in order of more radical ideas, including the idea of a one-state solution, which has all these issues which we mentioned a few minutes ago. So I hope this is helpful. I'll just, with your permission, I'll scroll by the comments here to see if anyone has any quick question. And since I don't see any, and already exceeded our time, I think this is where we're going to stop. Thank you all for taking the time to listen. I'm pretty sure, yeah, that the recording of this will be available on the Moment Magazine Facebook page, and I welcome you to share it. And if you have any questions, you can always reach me directly, of course, and you can, of course, you should subscribe to our now bi-weekly newsletter of Politics and Power and the Jewish World, in which some of these issues are discussed as well. And again, thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. Stay safe, wear your mask, and keep a distance from each other, and everything's going to be okay. Thanks.